also the bad face, and that duality makes him the perfect personification of America's fracking revolution. His death, like his legacy, was a hotly contested subject. On March 2nd, 2016, just after 9 a.m., Aubrey McClendon slammed his Chevrolet Tahoe SUV into a concrete viaduct on Midwest Boulevard in Oklahoma City, dying instantly. He was speeding, wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and didn't appear to make any effort to avoid the collision. Just one day earlier, a federal grand jury had indicted McClendon for violating antitrust laws during his time as the CEO of Chesapeake Energy. Investigators ultimately ruled the crash an accident, but rumors of suicide persist to this day. As Captain Paco Balderrama of the Oklahoma City Police told the press, we may never know 100% what happened. In the fall of 2008, Forbes had ranked McClendon number 134 on its list of the 400 richest Americans, with an estimated net worth of over $3 billion. But because he borrowed so much money and secured business loans with personal guarantees, 2 years after his death, lawyers were still wrangling over the remains of his estate, trying to figure out which debts would be paid, from the $500,000 he owed the Boy Scouts of America to the $465 million he owed a group of Wall Street creditors, including Goldman Sachs. Wall Street's vultures, hedge funds that invest in distressed debt, had descended, buying the debt for less than 50 cents on the dollar, essentially rendering a judgment that the claims were not going to be paid in full and that McClendon's estate was essentially bankrupt. If McClendon did die broke, it wouldn't have been out of character. During his years as an oil and gas tycoon, he fed on risk and was as fearless as he was reckless. He built an empire that at one point produced more gas than any American company except ExxonMobil. Once when an investor asked on a conference call, when is enough, McClendon answered bluntly, I can't get enough. Many think that without McClendon's salesmanship and his astonishing ability to woo investors, the world would be a far different place today. Stories abound about how at industry conferences, executives from oil majors like Exxon would find themselves speaking to mostly empty seats, while people literally fought for space in the room where McClendon was holding forth. In retrospect, it was kind of like Camelot, says Henry Hood, Chesapeake's former general counsel. There was a period of time that will never be duplicated, with a company that will never be duplicated. One of the first interviews I did for this book was with an investment analyst in New York who's covered oil and gas for decades and knows all the characters and all the players, and he was always really skeptical of Chesapeake and really skeptical of McClendon, and is a little bit skeptical of the fracking revolution for the reasons that we'll talk about. But he said, I never let Aubrey McClendon in the door for a meeting because I knew we would have ended up buying a ton of stock and it would not have ended well. But McClendon really tried and in many ways succeeded in reshaping the energy world. Ever since I read Daniel Yergin's The Prize years ago, I've been fascinated by all things energy. And although we don't think about it as much today, it's as critical to national security and to human history as it ever was. Even world wars have been won and lost by those who had the most access to energy and the securest access to it. And we don't think about it today, but even that iPhone you pull out to use, that's so much a part of our lives, even your electric car is powered by electricity, which in turn requires energy. And so while the world has changed so much and the production of energy isn't at the forefront of our national consciousness the way it once was, particularly in places outside of Texas, it's every bit as important, if not more so, than it ever has been. And I've been fascinated by Aubrey dating all the way back to 2010, a long time. A source of mine, an Australian that I talked to a lot, used to tell me that Aubrey McClendon was the most important man in America. Obviously, there's some degree of hyperbole at work in that. But what he meant was that if McClendon was right and America could produce all this natural gas thanks to the advent of fracking, that would reshape our economy here and make us a low-cost provider of energy, and meant that all sorts of businesses would relocate here that otherwise wouldn't be here. And it would change geopolitics. If McClendon was wrong, on the other hand, then the United States would look far different going forward. And that always stuck in my mind, the most important man in America. McClendon isn't the pioneer. He's not the person or people who figured out how to extract oil and gas from places in the earth that hadn't yet yielded it. Most people agree that the combination of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing that we've come to know as fracking. While people were doing it for ages, the person who figured out how to economically or how to get lots of oil and gas, get lots of gas out of the ground, was a guy named George Mitchell. And for anybody who's curious about the history of this, Greg Zuckerman, a Wall Street Journal reporter, wrote a book called The Frackers, which covers the history of this. But McClendon was the pioneer in the other essential part of the business, which was raising money. And I quote a guy in the book saying, "As oxygen is to life, capital is to the oil and gas business. This industry needs capital to fire on all cylinders, and the founder and father of raising capital for shale in the U.S. is Aubrey McClendon." McClendon himself said this: "To be able to borrow money for 10 years and ride out boom and bust cycles was almost as important an insight as horizontal drilling," he told Rolling Stone with typical immodesty. And this is true, that this industry is a voracious consumer of capital and requires an enormous amount, both to initially drill a well and then to keep producing. So from 2001 to 2012, McClendon's company Chesapeake sold, I think these numbers are stunning, $16.4 billion worth of stock and $15.5 billion of debt, and paid Wall Street more than $1 billion in fees. And that's just what was public. In less obvious ways, Chesapeake raised at least another $30 billion by selling assets and doing these Enron-esque deals, dare I say it, in which the company got what were in effect loans repaid with future sales of natural gas. And I think that fee number, that $1 billion, is really important, because you always have to remember that Wall Street can make money, even if the businesses they arrange funding for are losing money. There's a vig that Wall Street gets regardless of the ultimate success of the business. Look no further than subprime mortgages either. So my friend in Australia, John Hempton, would have these debates with a partner of his, and the partner would say, "The oil and gas are real." And John would say, "Yeah, but the economics don't work." And this was certainly true of McClendon's company. Before asset sales, it never produced free cash flow. And for those of you who are not finance types in the audience, think of cash flow as the sort of key ingredient, the truest measure of what you can pay for on your own without having to go out and raise more money from somebody willing to give you funds. It's a little bit like the income that you bring in from your job after your expenses, without having to go out and borrow on your credit card. And this turns out to be more broadly true of the industry as well. It wasn't just McClendon's company. It's actually the entire industry. A friend of mine on Wall Street said Aubrey did what everybody else did, just on steroids. And so in early 2015, a well-known skeptic named David Einhorn, and ironically enough, Einhorn was the first to call Lehman's bankruptcy back in the spring of 2008, went public and proceeded to lambaste fracking companies as financial hucksters, and he made this detailed case for betting against their stocks. He took a short position in a company called Pioneer Natural Resources, which he dubbed Mother Fracker. His team had looked at the financial statements of the 16 largest publicly traded fracking companies, including Pioneer, and he found that from 2006 to 2014, the fracking firms had spent $80 billion more than they had received from selling oil and gas. This was even during a period when oil prices were over $100 a barrel. None of them generated excess cash flow. In fact, in 2014, when oil was at $100 for part of the year, the group burned through $20 billion. So I quoted another well-known short seller named Jim Chanos saying the industry has a very bad history of money going into it and never coming out. And that's still true today. And some of the most recent analysis I saw was that from 2012 to mid-2017, the 60 biggest exploration and production companies in the U.S. Had negative free cash flow of $9 billion a quarter. And the most recent report I saw was a report in the Wall Street Journal that in the first quarter of 2018, only 5 of the fracking companies generated any positive cash flow, let alone a return for investors. So it's weird because we're sitting here on the 10th anniversary of the financial crisis, and most people don't think that the financial crisis has anything to do with fracking, but actually the two are pretty intimately linked, because if it weren't for the Federal Reserve's efforts to juice the economy in the wake of the financial crisis by slashing interest rates, there's a real debate as to whether fracking would have taken off to the degree that it did, because any industry that needs capital this voraciously needs cheap capital, and if fracking firms had to pay more for their debt, there's a question as to what size and scope this revolution would be. I quote a guy who's a fellow at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, and he wrote in a report, the real catalyst of the shale revolution was the 2008 financial crisis and the era of unprecedentedly low interest rates that it ushered in. So when you think of the controversies about fracking, most people think of environmental controversies. They don't think about the financial controversy. Most people think the key ingredient is fracking, and fracking is chemicals. I think the key ingredient is capital. So my book ignores some of the environmental issues caused by fracking, not because this isn't critically important, but A, it's a mini book, so there's only so much that you can cover in 100 pages. And just as inspiration, a friend of mine told me he actually read it on the beach, which was really exciting for me because never before has anybody called one of my books a beach read, so that's really exciting. But as a result of it being a small book, there's only so much you can cover. And I think the best portraits of the environmental side of this do come out in a pretty nuanced way. And if you're interested, I'd recommend 2 books. There's a book by another Wall Street Journal reporter named Russell Gold called The Boom, and then there's a book by a guy named Gary Cernovitz called The Green and the Black, and both of these are pretty nuanced attempts to weigh some of the environmental positives. For instance, the boom in natural gas and the incredibly cheap natural gas we're producing is what has killed coal, and arguably that's reduced our carbon dioxide quite a bit. So it's a real effort to weigh some of the positives with some of the negatives. I'm also, I have to admit, though, a little bit cynical, and I do think there's some truth to the notion that money rules the world, and as long as we need non-renewables like oil and natural gas, and there is a big question, which I'll come back to, about how long that will be, I don't think environmental concerns are ever going to stop us from producing them. What will stop the music is if the money stops flowing. And this industry is fragile, more so than I think people want to remember. In 2014, there was what some saw as a concerted attempt to kill it, when at OPEC's annual meeting that fall, Saudi Arabia refused to cut production. The prices were already falling, and the idea, what people saw Saudi Arabia's refusal to cut production, was a way of pushing oil prices still lower, therefore wreaking financial havoc on fracking companies. People who know Saudi Arabia well have cautioned me that you actually never really know what's going on there, and I'm sure there were multiple factors that played into their decision, some of which I cover in the book. But people saw this as a concerted attempt to kill the U.S. fracking industry. And it almost did. By mid-2016, American oil production had declined by nearly a million barrels a day, and some 150 oil and gas companies filed for bankruptcy. I'm actually convinced that the bust is part of why President Barack Obama overturned the ban on exports. And it was remarkably quiet when this happened, which is pretty shocking if you think about it. We had a 40-year ban on oil leaving this country, dating back to the 1970s, when widespread panics about oil shortages resulted in the passing of a series of laws that culminated in a ban on exports. And this ban on exports persisted all these decades, despite the fact that it flew in the face of our supposedly free market economy. And starting when fracking began to take off, oil and gas people began to push for the ban to be overturned. I think there might have been a lot more opposition to it, and environmentalists might have prevented it from being overturned. But amid the bust, suddenly everything was very quiet, and people thought, well, this kind of doesn't really matter anymore because this industry is going away. So I talked to the lobbyist who worked on the bill, getting it overturned, and he said actually many Democrats in the Obama administration were quietly in favor of it. They just couldn't come out and support it in any vocal way because they didn't want to anger environmentalists who were their constituents. So it got very quietly tucked into the year-end 2015 $1.1 trillion spending bill. And this lobbyist told me that the legislation passed the House and then the Senate before noon on December 18th, 2015. By the early afternoon, President Obama had signed it. Then everyone raced out of Washington for the holidays, so this guy was left alone. So he took himself out by himself for a steak in a Manhattan, alone in a restaurant. And he said, I thought this was a big, big deal and worthy of celebration. But it happened amid this bust where everybody thought that the fracking boom was over. And so when Aubrey McClendon died in the spring of 2016, it was almost like the punctuation mark underscoring the end of this thing. It seemed like the absolute bottom. But it wasn't. like the proverbial phoenix from the ashes, shale didn't die. It came back stronger than ever. This industry has been more resilient than anyone, even its proponents, would ever have dreamed. And believers argue that this proves that the skeptics were wrong. The mere fact that the industry survived this bust means that David Einhorn was wrong and that all the skeptics were wrong. And it looks that way. Right now, Einhorn's firm has lost a big chunk of its assets. Pioneer's stock price is higher than it was when he called for a short. So thus far, if you had to sort of stack it as a battle between the skeptics and the believers, you'd say believers TKO. But I don't think it's that simple, and I think there are a bunch of reasons why shale came back. One big reason is the Permian Basin, which I don't have to define to you guys. It was no secret that there was oil in the Permian, which had its first boom almost a century ago. But oil men thought it was mostly tapped out until entrepreneurs began to frack there around 2010. Scott Sheffield, the former chief executive of Pioneer, has said that the Permian could hold 75 billion barrels of oil, second only to Saudi Arabia's legendary Ghawar field. Believers say that technology, also a second reason, that technology is going to dramatically reduce the cost of fracking wells, reshaping the financial firmament so that companies can make money even with low oil prices. And yet this isn't happening yet. Companies are still losing money. And so it wasn't just the rediscovery of the Permian that helped restart the oil boom after plunging prices almost killed it. The most important factor is the one that started the boom in the first place. And I quote Jim Chanos as saying, "It came back because Wall Street was there." And he pointed out that in 2017, American fracking companies raised $60 billion in debt, up almost 30% since 2016. So I'm not smart enough to see how all this ends. I think one of the humbling realizations in writing this book, I set out to figure it out, and I think one of the humbling things in writing this book, as in writing any book, there are always humbling things, is that I didn't think I could figure it out. I decided, the former math major in me decided that shale was like calculus, like a really complicated form of calculus. It wasn't algebra, and there were just too many factors that go into determining whether this works or doesn't work for me to be able to really weigh the believers versus the skeptics and come up with an answer. And the other part of it was humbling, is that looking at the history of fracking, everybody who's tried to predict it has been wrong. And in fact, looking at the history of oil predicting and trying to predict the future direction of oil prices, almost everybody who makes a prediction is wrong, dating back to the fears of peak oil in the 1970s and in 1980s. So I also profiled another company in my book, a company located here called EOG Resources, which people call the Harvard of shale or the Apple of shale, is sort of the flip side, the flip counterpoint to Aubrey McClendon's Chesapeake, as the company that shows that this business can be done in a at least sort of financially sound way. But what I would say is that there's reason to be worried about the industry, because to me the key question is, how real would this revolution be if companies had to live within cash flow? If they could no longer raise all these billions and tens of billions of dollars in new capital, how much oil and gas would we actually be producing if companies had to live on the cash flow that they could produce? And there's no real answer, but even a big investor in this business said to me, if companies were forced to live within the cash flow they produce, U.S. oil would not be a factor in the rest of the world, and it would have grown at a quarter to half the rate that it actually has. Even beyond that, I came to believe that this whole concept of energy independence is pretty flawed. And energy independence, or energy dominance in its most robust form, is kind of this argument that we can look at the Middle East and say, we don't need you anymore. We don't need your oil. We can supply our own. We don't have to meddle in your affairs anymore. We can change the game with Russia and China. We now have leverage. But it's a bit of a fraud in a way, and the reasons are a couple. But one is that the price of oil is set globally. It's not. We can't turn the clock back to the 1970s when the U.S. could control the price of a barrel of oil. It's going to be out of our hands regardless of how much oil we're producing. It's going to be set by events around the world, including the situation in Libya now. Those things are going to affect drivers in the U.S., consumers in the U.S., regardless of how much oil we're producing. Secondly, another thing we can't turn the clock back on, we live in a global economy where a lot of the profits of our S&P 500 companies come from Europe, and where a lot of the products that our companies need come from Asia. So I found this really interesting analysis by a guy named Anthony Cordesman, and he analyzed the most recent U.S. Census Bureau data and found that 6 of the top 15 U.S. sources of imports are Asian states that are heavily dependent on Gulf petroleum exports. For instance, 20.5% of U.S. imports came from China, and these imports include critical components used by technology companies like Apple. So in other words, to risk Asia's economy by having problems in the Middle East escalate is to risk our own economy. So we can't afford to look away from the rest of the globe, no matter how much we might wish that we could do so. And I guess going back to the beginning, if low oil prices do cause instability in regions of the world, from Saudi Arabia to Nigeria to Venezuela, that are powder kegs already, how is that good for us? How is that? Forget about the humanitarian question. How is that economically good for us? Lastly, what I was really surprised by in working on this book was talking to not all the smart finance guys, but a handful of them who said they're actually no longer investing in oil and gas. And the reason why is that they think the age of renewables is much closer than most people think. And I was really surprised to hear that. I thought these guys would be kind of hardcore numbers guy who would sort of poo-poo renewables and say they're not even close to competitive on a cost basis. But their analysis was exactly the opposite. They're investing tons of intellectual energy trying to figure out when this is coming. And nobody can arrive at an answer. Again, it's calculus based on so many things. But the way my prism on this, thinking on this, shifted as I worked on this was reflected in what one investor said to me. He said, it doesn't have to be the end of the oil age. We just have to see when that is. It could be 50 years out, but as soon as we see when it's coming, the price of oil will go into a secular decline, and investment in this area will dry up. It may be that we use oil for another 100 years, but as soon as we see what the end game is, it's over from an investing standpoint. And so I think that to myopically, talk about energy independence and beat our chests about how great we are may give us some leverage in the world as it is. But if we don't keep investing in the future, we may be losers in the world as it's going to be. And I was really struck by a conversation I had with, do all of you know who Charlie Munger is? So he's Warren Buffett's sidekick, still kicking, still brilliant in his 90s. And he's actually weighed in on this whole issue of energy usage. And I thought his comments were really interesting. And he believes that we should conserve what we have instead of drilling frenetically, because he argues that for all the eventual certainty of renewables, there's still no substitute for hydrocarbons in several essential aspects of modern life, namely transportation and agriculture. And he argued, and I had not thought of it this way before, that part of why the U.S. can feed our population is because yield per acre has increased so dramatically in the modern era. And that's in large part due to pesticides, fertilizers, other agricultural products that are made through the use of hydrocarbons. And Munger said to me, we need to eat as far out as you can see. I certainly like eating. He said, it's a serious problem, and I think hydrocarbons as a chemical feedstock are probably irreplaceable. Maybe solar will work somehow, but we need a new technology that doesn't exist yet. For now, hydrocarbons are like the topsoil of Iowa. You wouldn't want to use it as fast as possible. You would want to use it as slowly as possible. So the lovely thing about being a journalist is that I get to point out problems and I don't actually have to come up with solutions. And I am definitely not a policy wonk, but I guess if I had to make policy, it probably wouldn't be focused on the here and now of how great we are to be producing so much oil and gas. It would be on pumping frenetically from the ground in ways that don't even make money for shareholders. Plenty of money for executives, plenty of money for private equity firms, plenty of money for Wall Street, but not even money for shareholders, let alone the rest of us, and perhaps think more long-term about what's worth conserving and what's worth spending now. And on that note, I will open it up to whatever questions you all have. And I spoke slowly enough, right? For once, maybe? Yeah, hi.
That was an excellent rundown. I thought, Bethany, I can add just a few reinforcing thoughts to you. I'd have lunch with a gentleman named George Mitchell about twice a month for years and years, who developed horizontal fracking and so forth. And I can assure you